Alright guys, welcome back to F1 News. We are 2 days away from practice in Bahrain. Mercedes have revealed major positive steps towards quality correlation between their simulator and their on-track running for the W15, but at the same time confirming their major suspension innovation may actually not provide them the advantage they were initially looking for. Very much into your thoughts on all this stuff in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. I'll greatly appreciate it. Firstly, the Horner updates, right? Because they're going to happen every day at this point, I imagine. If you guys didn't see the story yesterday, that apparently the dossier of information, the external report has now been completed, and it's effectively with the Red Bull management to decide what's going to happen. The feeling is that the decision here has basically been made, and it's expected to be communicated either today, which hasn't happened yet, or quite possibly tomorrow. This was potentially rather telling that if this is true, that Christian Horner will not be at the team principal's press conference on Thursday, at least as of the details we have seen today with the press conferences. They basically put out which drivers, which team principals are going to be at each one, and I guess Horner's not been spotted. So the Thursday one will have Vasseur, Brown, Wolff and Mekies from Ferrari, McLaren, Mercedes and of course RB respectively. Now just for some context here, as he goes on to say, for the last 10 years, for at least the last 10 years, the team principal of the defending champions has always been present at this first press conference, especially when you've got the other teams that are going to be potentially chief challengers with Red Bull this season. We've got Ferrari, McLaren and Mercedes all represented here, and of course they've also got Zak Brown and Mekies and potentially Horner, right? Because that's the whole, Zak Brown isn't a big fan of the whole RB Red Bull relationship, and probably for good reason in some parts, so it's probably quite poetic that they've decided to put all those guys together, but no Horner, right? Which is very rare, as is mentioned, that Horner would not be at the first TP press conference of the year. So there's got to be something to that, you would imagine. We'll probably know tomorrow what the future of that is going to be. There's also been lots of updates on the driver market. Alpine have said that they're not really interested in giving Schumacher a test drive. He is actually driving for their WEC project right now, but yeah, Alpine seems to be on a massive downhill spiral, and even they are making it very clear in all of their announcements, even like their pre-Bahrain kind of, well, public service announcement, whatever the teams tend to do, they've basically played down their chances. So it's not looking pretty for this team. They even said that it's not going to be an easy start for us in terms of the drivers. That car is not going to go particularly well, it seems, especially at Bahrain. Maybe they can bring upgrades that can turn their season around, but yeah, far behind where they need to be as a works team. And even there's some feeling that even Haas could potentially be faster than this team as it stands, which is not where they want to be. Now, Liam Lawson, we thought for some time he was getting a seat this season. That never happened. Perez stayed. Of course, it's Ricciardo and Tsunoda in the RB. But it seems that Lawson is definitely still part of their plans for the future, because he's going to be doing some testing. Now, this happens because in 2024, that now means the 2022 cars are available to be tested by younger drivers in testing programs they might want to run. So it's a 2-year gap, basically. So they can't test the W13 for Mercedes or the RB18 for Red Bull until now, but now they can. So they're going to put Lawson in those cars from a couple of years ago in the ground effect era, right? The car's now quite different to 2021 and before, so makes sense that they would do this. And Mercedes are doing the same thing with Kimi Antonelli, so he'll be doing a big run this season. Of course, driving in Formula 2, his rookie season over there, but will also be running an intensive Formula 1 program in parallel, of course only 17 years old, in the Mercedes W13. So, you know, actually a race-winning car, and to be fair, by the end of the season, it was a pretty competent machine at certain circuits. So Antonelli will get the chance to do lots of testing, as much as they allow him basically to do in the W13, to get a feel for these ground effect era cars, so that when he is potentially driving the W16 next season, he will be as prepared as possible. It's still a massive question as to whether Antonelli will be the man to directly replace Hamilton, or the boy really to replace Hamilton, because he's still only 17. Next year will be 18. But yeah, that would be quite the decision if Toto Wolff and Mercedes make that call to put him alongside George Russell straight away. There is the general feeling that yes, Antonelli's very talented. Mercedes don't want to miss out on the next Verstappen, but there's also a feeling that maybe it makes more sense to see how Antonelli does in Formula 2. If he does very well, then maybe a Williams seat could be an option before then coming to Mercedes, maybe after 1 or 2 years of Alonso or Albon or something along those lines, if they went down that route instead. But it really depends on what happens in the first few races. Mercedes can't wait forever, you know, they can't wait until Abu Dhabi Dhabi to determine who's the F2 champion before they then bring him in. I mean, they could, but they probably won't. They'll take probably the first 5-6 races of this Formula 2 season, see where Antonelli stands. And obviously there's lots of pressure on this kid, right? And people have been saying that it's unfair to put all the pressure on him, but like at the end of the day, if you're in this sport to be a champion, you know, you've got to deal with the pressure that comes from all the media attention of being a very talented young driver. So we'll see how Antonelli fares. I know people are expecting maybe a similar performance to Behrman had last year, when Ollie Behrman, of course, is touted in the Ferrari Academy right now to be an F1 driver possibly in the future, maybe for Haas, maybe elsewhere. Haas have been very interested, and there's been some thoughts as to whether he could even be partnering Leclerc in a few years when Hamilton, let's say, retires. But he had an interesting season last year. Behrman was very competitive, but had some weekends he was great, some weekends where he wasn't really, at the races, getting used to the tyres, all these other things. So if Antonelli is like that, then maybe Mercedes will think twice. But if Antonelli really hits the ground running, then they might be very tempted to put him straight in the Mercedes, although many would say put somebody else in the car for the meantime, such as maybe Fernando Alonso, who is obviously understood as being a viable option. It will depend on how Aston Martin do this year, and there's a feeling that they actually might have a more competitive car than it seems like they did in the testing, but I think Alonso's been very clear that leaving Aston Martin and joining a theoretically superior team would be an option, right? Because at the end of the day, Alonso wants to secure that 33rd race victory before his retirement, I'm sure. And if Aston aren't in position to make that a reality, or actually give a championship contending car to Alonso, then he will try and find a place where that is possible. Now, Red Bull might be an option there, but that seems, well, it depends. Do you want to put Alonso and Verstappen next to each other? Bringing Alonso into a highly competitive team is it can be a bit of a recipe for disaster, so maybe they're looking at other options instead. Helmut Marko, though, said that Alex Albon is not really an option or something they're considering because he's got a contract until 25 with Williams, which is true, but, there were rumours that if they wanted Albon, they could try and get him, and the belief is that they actually did say to Albon, like, hey, we will give you first option, or basically we'll sign you in 2026 possibly if you agree to just be committed to our future at Red Bull. So I'm not really sure what Marko is saying here is actually true based on what we've heard behind the scenes, but it's still maybe more doubtful than other options. Sainz, I'm sure, has been throwing his hat around as well. We saw Carlos Sainz Sr. was spotted with Horner and Marko during the Bahrain test, potentially discussing a Sainz-Verstappen reunion, but even Marko says Sainz probably wants to make a decision sooner than we do. So Red Bull are going to bide their time on this, and I guess the chief options would be Daniel Ricciardo or Yuki Tsunoda. I just don't think that they really see Tsunoda as the man, but to be fair, I think this also depends to some degree on the future of Horner, because we know that Christian Horner is a big Daniel Ricciardo fan, whereas Marko, I think, is more inclined towards Yuki and less inclined towards Daniel. So if Horner was to go, I think it does lower chances somewhat of Ricciardo getting the seat. There's also the fact that Ricciardo is such a massive marketing tool that, given that VCARB, or whatever you want to say, is basically entirely a marketing, profit-driven venture, they actually might be very tempted to keep Ricciardo in that team because he brings more eyeballs. So it might be a blessing and a curse somewhat for Ricciardo that he's just so damn marketable. But Marko does say that, both they'll be in consideration, not just about staying in F1. And this is the other point that, I think it's quite likely that one of these two guys is no longer in the sport next season, because whoever loses out of the pair of them, I just don't see Red Bull keeping them on for another year, especially with Liam Lawson waiting in the wings. Now, Perez could stay, although that might be doubtful, although Marko does say that Perez could stay if he comes second in the championship, which is pretty funny way for Red Bull to say that we have the best car by such a long way, that Verstappen's already won the championship. So if Perez comes second like he did last year, then maybe he'll stay. But based on the numbers we saw at testing, the fact that the field at testing, based on the data, was Verstappen, and then it was Ferrari, Mercedes, Perez, like Alonso, stuff like this, right? So you pretty much had Verstappen's lap times and then the chasing pack with Perez mixed in. So based on that evidence and also Perez's poor qualifying performance last year, there was some serious doubt that Perez will get seconds in this year's championship. But, who knows? Maybe this year's Red Bull is even more dominant and even he can pull that one off. Now, there was also some updates as we dive into the Mercedes drama, really, on Hamilton, Ferrari and Toto Wolff. So the whole story behind the scenes here was pretty wild when the rumours were first coming out that this was going to be happening. Now, to be fair, this was first reported in the Italian media by Formula Uno and those guys that are very close to Ferrari. So the immediate thought was that possibly this had been leaked by Ferrari to the press, and I think my feeling was that they knew this was going to get revealed. I don't think it was a surprise to Ferrari and to Hamilton that this was coming up publicly, because the feeling was Hamilton talked about it, the fact that he hadn't told anyone, and he went to meet with Toto Wolff earlier in the week, only a couple of days before it was revealed, to discuss it and say, hey, yeah, like I'm gonna be out of here and going to Ferrari. I'm going to be out of here, and of course, going to Ferrari next year. But it seems like they were prepared for this to be announced, and they were expecting it to be leaked. And even there's rumours that Piero Ferrari, among others, were telling all sorts of guys what was going on. Leclerc knew, Gasly knew, I think Zhou Guanyu knew as well, because he works with the same kind of like trainer, personal manager, whatever, as Hamilton now does again. So all these guys knew. I think it was inevitable that it was coming public. But there were some questions like, who actually revealed this to the public? And to be honest, I thought that it was coming kind of from Ferrari and from the Italian media, because that's where I believe it originally was sourced from. But now in Gazzetta here, there was some discussion that actually Toto initiated this leak. So, you know, I don't really know if I buy this necessarily, just because when this was all happening and people were reaching out to Mercedes and to Ferrari asking for comments, and Mercedes were like, yep, we have no comment at this time, basically, or they basically refused to reply, right? So then it shut down any of the rumours, and then it took a little bit of time for everyone to prepare their full announcement. So maybe this doesn't really matter, but I did think it was nonetheless quite interesting that potentially Toto Wolff, having heard the details of the Hamilton move, was not so happy and therefore leaked it to the press. But I don't know if that's necessarily fully true. There's some pretty funny replies here, to be fair. There's also this, speaking of Mercedes, though, on Mike Elliott, right? So this is Mike Elliott. He was, okay, not fired, but kind of fired from his role during last season when James Allison, of course, returned to become their technical director. Mike Elliott was promoted to the chief technical officer role before then resigning and stepping away in interesting circumstances. Now, it's a funny time for Mike Elliott, because lots of his ideas, such as the cannons at the back of the car, obviously the very slim side pods that they stuck with, that Mercedes abandoned during the W14 cycle in 2023, have now been adopted to some degree by the RB20. Now, Red Bull is saying, and Pierre Wache is saying that, you know, it's not exactly the same. Our designs are much better than Mercedes, and sure, we might be taking some inspiration, but the way we're doing it is much superior. So, you know, maybe Mercedes was still right to get rid of Elliott, or whatever you want to say, and at the end of the day, them sticking with that kind of their guns on that for the second year of the regulations is what has really derailed Mercedes' progress over the last couple of years. But I think mainly it was, you know, suspension floor, these other factors that they didn't change that they should have done, that probably cost Elliott his job. But it is interesting for Elliott, because apparently other teams are interested in his services to try and sign him up to their team, and maybe Mercedes will have to come around and say, you know what, now we've got this mechanical platform that's performing better, but actually Red Bull are correct that some of our other ideas did generate higher downforce, and therefore they might have to introduce those as time progresses, which would be, yeah, pretty unfortunate for Elliott, I suppose. But this year's W15 certainly is much better than last year's, right? It's Mercedes' best test, no doubt about it, in Bahrain of this cycle of regulations, and Toto says the drivers are much happier with the overall balance, the basic platform is working as expected, the correlation to our simulations looks to be accurate. And this is the key point, right? And even during 2022, when the W13 was struggling, the big talking point at the start was the simulations, what happens on track, are just so much different that we couldn't even believe it. Mercedes thought that W13 was going to be an absolute rocket ship when it turned up to Bahrain. They thought it was going to be a second a lap faster than their other version, but obviously that wasn't true. And even next year, on the W14 cycle, they were still discussing that they would do things with the car and it wouldn't create the effect that they wanted it to create. So this past, well, couple of days in Bahrain last week, let's say, there was this major innovation spotted from Mercedes, changing the angle of one of the wishbones on the front suspension to introduce far more anti-dive. So this is a feature which we haven't really seen anybody else pull off. You guys can see here, this was version 1 with the wishbone mounted higher, and then they basically swapped this around and mounted it lower to the chassis. Now, as far as the experts and the engineers say, this is actually a real challenge to pull this off, and it's something that Mercedes will have to have prepared for months in advance to have multiple mounting points to enable this to actually work. So there's a few things to say on this. Firstly, could they change it during a race weekend? I don't see why they couldn't, but you know, let's say you do practice 1 and there's so many other things you can change on the car. You're going into FP2, you're thinking, well, if we change this around, is that really going to be, you know, the problem? Is that going to be the solution? if your simulations don't work properly, then you don't really know. But I think one of the reasons why they did this, and one of the reasons why they tried it on the third day, was to find the correlation between whether what they saw this would do on the data was actually seen when the car arrived to the track. And that was the discussion in the AMUS article of today, that on the final day of testing, they put this more extreme anti-dive configuration in the front suspension, and it actually performed worse for the drivers, which is interesting in and of itself because the Mercedes was arguably the most competitive on the final day. Russell, of course, was only 500ths off having the fastest time on the final day, and I think Hamilton and Russell's long runs are both pretty impressive on that day. So, maybe the car was worse in that format than it was before, but actually the other things made it perform at least reasonably well. So they made this adjustment, and it didn't help the car. It actually made the car perform worse. It seems the rear of the car was becoming more restless in the braking zones of the corner entries with this front suspension change in play, which I guess makes sense because, whatever happens at the front affects what is happening at the rear of the car as well. But so basically, one version might be better than the other, and therefore they're not going to bother with this tweak that they can make over the rest of the season, which, might be a bad thing because Mercedes put a long time into, I imagine, making this work. No other team has anything to this effect, but maybe one version is just superior to the other and therefore they'll stick with that all season long. But you never know. What if you go to an interesting circuit like a Monaco or a Singapore or something a little bit different to normal, and actually the simulation says that the other version is going to be better than the standard version they have? It's still plausible that at some point this season they do use this change to seemingly try and gather some degree of advantage, and that is because they believe the correlation is accurate on this. So the engineers have actually suspected before the final day that making this change would make the car worse and have a negative effect on the driving behavior, which is interesting because they put it into the car, right? They've made the decision to create this in such a way that they can make that change, but yet they believed it was going to make the car worse. So why would they do that other than if they believe it might make the car better at some circuits and some situations, or they just went on a very roundabout way to try to figure out whether their expectations became reality. But I don't think they would do this unless they believed there was some potential advantage to be conferred at some circuits. So maybe in Bahrain, their simulation said, yeah, it's going to make the car perform worse. But maybe at some circuits, their simulations say, well, actually, no, if we do change the anti-dive level, that will improve the performance of the platform of the car. I don't know, difficult to say. But the engineers thought that it was going to make the car worse in those situations at Bahrain, and it did. The drivers complained, so the engineers like, all right, sound, brilliant. Maybe this other anti-dive version is useless and won't be used for the whole season, which I guess isn't ideal, but it does at least confirm for Mercedes that what they thought was going to happen actually did. So they can now trust, within a great degree of accuracy, that what they see on their simulation data is actually true. And therefore, in theory, they can go to a circuit and they can run the numbers and see what the computer says in terms of how they should set up their car, and they can be confident that that's actually true, because Red Bull haven't really suffered with any of that from day one. Mercedes have suffered with that on and off for the last 2 years, and apparently it's now solved. So very much enjoyed your thoughts on all this stuff in the comment section below. Just one interesting thing I thought to point out here from F1 Stats Guru as well. Verstappen does not have the best record in Bahrain historically, and even Red Bull themselves, they have had, I think, 7 driver DNFs from the last 6 races, or maybe 6 from the last 7 or something like that, across both cars that they've been in Bahrain. So, and Verstappen himself has 5 DNFs from his 10 races at Bahrain, the most he's had at any venue. Baku, Silverstone at 3, and then the other ones here. But yeah, Bahrain, he's had 5 DNFs, and of course it was the case in 2022 when both Red Bulls called it a day at the end of that Grand Prix. So if this is anything to go by, we could have an interesting race in a few days' time. But very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.